Grief in the workplace, how do you support your team members? This presentation really takes us to the essence of this course, and that is what can you do as a leader to be supportive to people in your organization who are grieving? We're going to start with a true or false quiz. And what I'm going to suggest you do is push pause on this slide, think about each of these 6 statements, and decide for yourself, is it true or is it false? And then we'll talk about them. Now, the answer to all those statements is false, and here's why. We know that for some people, it may be perfectly normal to keep their loved ones' clothes, belongings, room intact, as long as they're moving forward in their life and they're not stuck. That could be normal for them. We also know there really is no time frame, and then there's this concept of, well, what is normal at work or school? So that's false too. We really can't say that there's a time frame when people should be functioning relatively normally. Um, Emotional reactions, again, what we find here is that is normal to be emotionally upset about the death of a loved one. The challenge becomes that in the workplace, you typically aren't emotional, right? We don't typically cry in the workplace. That's where the friction comes into play. But that is a normal reaction to loss. It's also perfectly normal to not react that way. Most people would benefit from grief counseling. No, that's false. We know actually that 80% of people accommodate to the loss without any intervention. And the last one, your employee is grieving and their performance is below standards, so I should let it go. That's actually false too. There's a way to approach that by connecting with the person and making them feel comfortable to talk about what's happening. When I first started working with organizations around this, I came up with a model to explain my perception of what is most helpful for companies. And the model's called EASE, and there's 4 components to it. With the biggest component, or the most time spent, in the educate piece. And as you can appreciate from this course, everything that you've learned helps to inform the decisions you would make to support individuals who are grieving in the workplace. So whenever I go into workplaces, I do spend a lot of time on the educate piece, obviously not to the same depth as what you've experienced here. And that helps people understand why they need to do things a certain way to support individuals who are grieving. So the first thing being that there really isn't a finish line. Um, it is very likely that you're going to experience grief uh, over a loved one for the rest of your life. It's going to change. It's not going to be as intense as it is early on. And there really isn't this line that you cross where suddenly you aren't grieving anymore. Um, so that's something that's often unknown to people. People don't really understand that. So that's a helpful part of the education piece. It's also helpful to teach people in the organization that there are multiple types of losses, death losses, non-death losses, ambiguous losses, and they all can create a grief reaction. We spent some time on um, the background and research around grief and bereavement. And the takeaway from that I hope you got, was that the 2 most current and useful theories are the continuing bonds and dual process. The other theories were helpful in starting thinking around grief and bereavement, but they aren't considered current with what we're seeing today. So continuing bonds, that death ends the life, but not the relationship. So I'm going to ask you to think about that in the context of a workplace. So that means that it really wouldn't be unusual for someone to be at work and wanting to talk about their loved one who's died, or maybe putting a picture up on their desk. That would be actually considered quite normal. The dual process model is really helpful for thinking about what you might see from someone at work. This means that we might see performance really fluctuating. You know, someone could in the morning be very much in a dark place, very upset, and then by the afternoon, maybe more focused on what's going on at work. And so this would be perfectly normal. The idea from your side is, if you can have open conversations with someone about how things are going, maybe structure their work to the times of the day that are easiest for them or where they have the most energy. Because typically you'll start to see some patterns, or the person will be aware of some patterns. We've talked about all the signs and expressions of grief. And the one I wanted to just highlight here that matters from a workplace perspective is sometimes this social piece. If you have someone who used to be quite actively engaged with others, having lunch with them, and now they're keeping to themselves, what sometimes happens is the other people start to think, well, did I do something wrong? Have I said something inappropriate? And so part of the education piece is helping everyone understand that that might be very normal behavior for that person, and it doesn't have anything to do with them. Um, they're withdrawing for their own reasons, not because their colleagues have said or done something wrong. So when you start to educate other people in the workforce about all of these things, it really helps them be more supportive. Um, so let me just move forward here. The work of Robert Niemeyer is really helpful in thinking about workplace grief and bereavement practices and policies. He did a study where he surveyed 1,200 individuals who had had a significant loss in their life, and he asked them to reflect back on the first 2 years after their loss and assess their own level of functioning. So it was a self report. And what they said was in the early days, within the first 2 weeks, to, they would have assessed themselves as doing okay. I'm managing okay. And if you think about that first couple of weeks after someone dies, usually there's a lot of support around you. You're also very busy with funeral plans, paperwork, looking after things. And so to outsiders, you may look like you're doing okay. And if you think about it in the workplace, your colleagues come to the funeral, you seem like you're doing okay, you're on. And so people make that assumption. But what most of them said was that as time went on, they started to feel worse for a while. And so, right around this 6 month period, they would say like things were very difficult. And this is actually where I would get called into an organization. They'd say, we have this executive, they're back at work. We thought they would be okay by now, but they're not doing so well. And this is really important for us to think about in the context of grief and bereavement policies. And you're going to read too, but I want you to think about this as it relates to bereavement and what we see. And so then they say, at about the 6 month mark, that was the worst for me. And then they have some dips. And then over time, they find that they get used to it. They accommodate to their loss and they're doing okay. Now, the exception to this is we often hear from parents who have had a child die that their second year was worse than their first year. And I would, of course, never say that to someone whose child died. Um, but it's just something for you to think about as a leader. If you have someone who's had their child die, that this could be a very long time before the individual is back to full productivity. And what can you do to support them as they manage their life with their new normal? And then the last piece, which I've already said earlier, is that 80% of individuals accommodate to death loss without any clinical intervention. So this is also something to really keep in mind for yourselves when you're working with people, that, referring someone to counseling is not always the answer. And that people do tend to figure it out over time. The accommodate part of the model is where we're going to turn next, and that is what can you do to support someone who's grieving? If you've taken the human resource management course already, you know that there are workplace policies around your duty to accommodate as a leader, um, various illnesses or conditions that people have in the workplace. Because grief is not an illness, though, often it doesn't fall under that category. And the accommodation I'm going to talk about are just everyday things you can do to be supportive of someone. So the first thing is recognizing, you know, if someone's asking for time off, to do what you can to be flexible. Really, that's the essence. Do what you can to be flexible because they wouldn't be asking if they didn't feel that they needed it. I'm proposing a model to think about how you help someone, and that is connect, collaborate, and communicate. And if you're doing these three things, you have a much better chance of providing someone in the workplace with the support that they need. So the first part is right after someone has a loss, if they reach out to you and say, my husband died, um, then that connection has started there, right? As you're talking to them. Um, if they don't reach out to you, if you just hear it through human resources, be brave. Take it upon yourself to contact the person and express your condolences. But now you can actually be in leader mode and say, okay, what are you comfortable with me sharing with the team? Um, and you can ask them that. And you may say, people are wondering if they should come to the funeral. And you can have a conversation with someone about that. So that's already the first start. You've connected, and now you're collaborating on how the person wants their news to be communicated to others, if they want people from work to come to the funeral. Um, and then you are going to be communicating with others. So that's from the funeral perspective. I'm also suggesting that you reach out before someone's first day back at work. And here again, you can say to someone, what would you like your first day to look like? What would you like to happen? And they may say, I don't want to take any calls on my first day, or I only want to come in for half a day and then work at home for the rest of the day. And so accommodate that. So again, you're connecting, you're collaborating with them on what they want that first day to look like, um, and then you're communicating with others. Some suggestions that have been very helpful to people is you can ask them if they'd like to visit the office before their first official day back, just to talk to people. And so my colleague, Leslie Perrott, who's on my Salacium website, when her child was murdered, it was all over the media, and she knew everybody was wondering what was going on. So she chose to go in early and just go around and talk to everybody because she wanted to get that over with before she came back into work mode. You can also say, would you like to walk in with someone? And the reason you do that is because when the person left work, their life was a certain way, and now they're coming back and everything's changed. And sometimes just having someone walking beside you into the building can it's support. It also alleviates the problem if, someone comes over and isn't aware of the circumstances, says something like, "Hey, Brenda, I haven't seen you in a long time. Have you been on vacation?" Now you have someone who can offer some interference and just be supportive. You can also ask them if they'd like to send an email to their colleagues about what they need. So, this again gives them some agency. So they may want to send a note to everyone. Thank you for all of your support. When I come back to work, I would feel better not to talk about my loss, right? So you could set them up that way. Um, they can create a script. I had an executive I worked with whose wife died, and he was very uncomfortable with everyone continually asking him how his children were doing. But he also didn't want to push people away. So we created a script together where he would just say, oh, thank you for asking. I really appreciate your support. We're all doing the best we can. And then he would move right on to talking about business. So he was polite, but he signaled that that wasn't something he wanted to talk about at work. Another thing you can do is just say to the person, listen, if you need to leave, just go. I'll understand. And I will bet that person will never just leave in the middle of the day. But because you've said that to them, they feel that you are supporting them and that if they needed to, they could. So they don't have stress around that. And then the last idea is, offer that they could bring someone in. I know several people who have done this, that, someone I know whose child died, he brought his best friend with him to work, who set up in the office beside his for the whole first week he was back at work. Someone else brought their sister. So this costs you nothing as an organization, costs you nothing, and it can just be so helpful to the person. My suggestion is, though, always ask and don't tell the person you should do this, or, just offer these ideas and then let the person choose. Now, if we move on to the third part of the model, which is support, I might surprise you here and say that the support I'm talking about is to support the individual around the grieving person. So they're coming back into a team, and probably the team is very nervous about what to say or do. So if you can, bring the team together and have an open conversation about what's going on. Mostly the team wants to know, what can I expect? How is the person doing? How can I be helpful? And then you can ask people, what are they worried about and how are they feeling? And that's often where you start to hear people talk about their own losses and maybe it's triggered it for them. A group I worked with, there was an individual who used to ride into work with someone every single day. He would go pick this person up, and now this other person's child had died, and so he was really nervous. He thought, like, I don't know if I should go pick him up for work. What am I going to say when we're sitting together? And when we were able to talk that through, and also with the help from his teammates, he felt so much better about doing that. And part of that is to just be really upfront with the person, say, I'm so sorry. And when we're riding together, if you want to talk or not talk, it's totally fine. And, I'm just glad to see you and I want to help you as best I can. Right? What a great way to offer respect for the person's space, but to say that you're there. The other thing that sometimes crops up is gatekeeping. And so, an executive that I worked with didn't know this, but her executive assistant was actually making decisions about who should talk to her, who shouldn't. So she was grieving the death of a child, and people started going to her EA to say, should I talk to her about this today? And the EA was making the assessment of whether they should or shouldn't. And when she found out this was something she wanted to put an end to because it eroded her position as a leader, and it was also taking on too much burden from her EA. So these again are things to watch for. People think they're being helpful, but if you know that this could happen, then you can also talk to people about this quite openly. The other thing that can happen, and I'll just give you a minute, you may want to just push pause and just read this headline, and then I'll post the whole article in our shell for you to read. But essentially, what happened is um, a mom's daughter died, and she would talk to her colleagues about it, and they were already doing extra work, picking up some of her files for her, but they were finding it too much. And so they complained to their boss. They wanted this person to stop talking about her deceased child. And the boss called the mom in and didn't handle the conversation well. The mom fled the building, and ultimately the company fired her. And when she went to court, um, her firing was upheld. They said, "You abandoned your job." Now we can all stand back and say, "Oh my gosh, like what a terrible decision on the part of the company. This is a big organization, um, you know, making such a poor decision. Ortho McNeil Pharmaceutical, huge company." But we have to stand back and say there's a lot of things maybe that weren't happening there. So maybe no one was supporting the boss. Maybe he had no training on what to say or do. Um, Nobody was supporting her colleagues. And that could mean just checking in with them to say, I know Brenda's back at work. Maybe she's talking about her brother a lot. I just wonder how you're doing with everything. And just by giving people the chance to talk to you, then they feel supported. So I always encourage you to think of this as um, an organizational system to have a look at. It's not just the person who's grieving who's going to be impacted, it's everybody around them. And the extent that you can be touching base with different people at different times and aware of these things potentially cropping up will really help the individual for sure, because they'll feel supported and their team will feel supported so that they can step in and be more supportive to the person who's grieving. And then the last piece is just empathy. Most of us can be empathetic for a few days, some of us for a couple of weeks, some longer, but you may need to be empathetic for the long term. And that may mean thinking through milestone days. I gave a talk at a conference in Alberta about grief in the workplace, and someone came up to me afterward and told me that their HR manager continues to check in with them 15 years after the death of her son every Mother's Day. Leading up to Mother's Day, this HR person will always come over to her and say, "How are you managing this year?" And she said that just means so much to her. When everyone else has probably forgotten, this one person at work remembers that this is a really tough time of the year for her, and she so appreciates that. So if there are ways that you can be thoughtful and helpful and just mindful of what could be going on for this person into the long term, it can really make a positive impact for them. So I think the last piece I want to just say is, people do find a way to get through, and the extent to which you can be helpful and, clear away obstacles for them, educate the people around them, will make a really big difference for someone. And they will always remember how helpful you were. They will. They will always remember it. And, you will feel like you've done something really good to help someone. So thank you for listening to this. My references are on the next slide, and I look forward to seeing your answers to the policy questions in our posting this week.